So now 10th edition 40k has had its first proper index errata, we perhaps have the final reveal on what Games Workshop's initial plans for the game are, with a few of the major bugs fixed. Let's talk about the major winners or losers from the balance update, and which models or units might be hitting the tables more or less competitively now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk a little bit more about Games Workshop's latest errata pass, and quickly just go through what I consider perhaps some of the biggest winners and losers that affect some of the strongest units in their respective armies. As they've been fairly clearly telling us for quite some time at the moment, the 40k index update was very much an error fix as opposed to an actual balance pass. The first one of those is apparently going to be happening in September sometime. This update was mainly Games Workshop trying to patch up any typos, non-functional rules, or slightly silly combos that they hadn't really thought about, and there really were quite a lot of those from the indexes, though I'd say the vast majority of changes were kind of obvious what they meant, and perhaps aren't huge surprises. In this video I thought we'd talk through a few of the minor changes, and then 2 main winners and 3 main losers out of the units, focusing on things that were kind of strong for their armies already and might actually have some impact on the competitive game. We'll talk through each unit, what made it good, and where it perhaps stands now after the update. For the main selections for this one I thought I'd focus a bit more on the actual rules changes as opposed to just non-functional stuff becoming functional, as I feel like that was kind of expected already. First up, just for some honourable mentions, these are some I'd consider either minor winners or minor losers from the update. Definitely things that are important to their armies, but maybe not quite as big changes to quite as central units for their army competitively. For some more minor winners, the Silent King at least no longer has the chance of his Minears going nuclear. It's just the King himself who has the chance for the big deadly demise with that enslaved Star God on his back, though I think at the moment I'd still consider him a fairly pricey model for what he brings to the table. Otherwise, nice they fixed the Leagues of Votann appraising Glare. That's perhaps their best enhancement that allows you to get more judgment token goodness on objectives. The Death Corps of Krieg infantry squad are pretty competitively relevant for the Imperial Guard. They actually get to equip their med pack now rather than just having essentially non-functional rules for it. And I guess you could perhaps argue a few of the things that they might have errated but chose not to might be considered minor winners. Things like Tyrannid Spore Mines from Biovores, scoring them all the tactical objectives, or the few units that can potentially fire infinitely if their opponent keeps on targeting units with more shots, things like the Hexmark Destroyer, and there are a few other examples out there that perhaps aren't quite as powerful. For things that were toned down but perhaps remain good, Barb Gaunts can only debuff one enemy infantry unit each turn, but they're still pretty decent both for their damage and defensive profile for just 10 points, and still slow down one important enemy infantry unit. I think they remain nice for the Tyrannids. The Imperial Knights did have it confirmed that their rerolls are the less powerful of the 2 ways that people were interpreting them, probably for the best given that they're a very strong faction overall. The single 1 rerolls are still very nice with things like Armiger Thermal Spears. Cryptothralls for the Necrons can no longer have the rules reading where you kind of argue that they give their entire unit fights on death. That was a big deal for things like Lichguard, though it seems super unintentional to me. And Gretchen no longer have the curiosity where they can get toughness 5 in melee due to their runt herds in the unit, again quite an unintentional oversight, and both Cryptothralls and Gretchen remain absolutely amazing value, one making tanky warriors or Lichguard even more of a nightmare to remove, and Gretchen scoring you objectives for cheap, screening the enemy and farming CP. Getting onto the units that I consider perhaps slightly more major winners and losers though, it seems that perhaps one of the biggest losers of the update is the Eldar Wraithguard. These ghost warriors with the Wraith cannons were being played really quite commonly competitively for Eldar armies, a big tanky Wraith battle line with toughness 7, a 2+ save and 3 wounds, quite a nice anvil to all of the fast moving fire support units that can move around them, things like fire prisms and hornets and faster movers to score objectives. Big units of them with a Spirit Seer were a competitive staple for the Eldar, slogging slowly up the board and getting into range with the Wraith cannons at strength 14, AP4 and damage D6 with devastating wounds. They're really quite a lot more reliable than plenty of other close-range anti-tank weapons due to their War Construct rule that could allow them to return fire if they were attacked in melee. The rule is that once per battle round, when an enemy unit attacks the unit, when the enemy is finished attacking, they get to shoot back as if it were the shooting phase. Really quite nice if they had something that was worth shooting back within 12 inches, and potentially trying to kill a big enemy threat in their own turn. The nerf they got from that was that previously this rule also gave them the pistol keyword, which meant that they could fire in combat with either the Wraith Cannon or the D-Scythe, so it meant that if your opponent charged in, say killed maybe 1 or 2 of them, or even none at all, the Wraithguard unit could then just turn around and open fire on them at point blank range, making them a real tricky prospect to charge. Now though, locking them up is going to be a massive issue, and you might be able to lock up a whole load of very valuable models and make them unable to fire their Wraith cannons. You could still fall back and shoot them due to feigned retreat for one command point, but at least that drains CP. On top of that, they also had a nerf to the spirits here, which did seem like a bit of a typo really. Previously the rule stated that you could revive one Wraithguard per command phase, rather than just in your own command phase, meaning that you could effectively be restoring 60 points worth of model between the enemy shooting them at one time and again, which did seem unintended. I still say the spirits here is pretty much auto-include if you are running them. Hitting better and reviving models is still great, even if it has been toned down compared with before. The Spirits here change seems very sensible, though I'm not 100% sure that changing that pistol rule was really the best fix. It did seem quite a nice way to keep them relevant and actually have their guns remaining scary. I think they could fire in combat in 9th edition, I remember. Maybe if they were just a bit overtuned that way, then perhaps a points nerf might have been more effective, as opposed to making them super vulnerable to enemy charges when they're going to be on the front line. In any case though, with two really quite major nerfs, I feel like Eldar List might well be looking elsewhere. It is an index with an awful lot of very competitive units that can step in to fill the gap. Perhaps one of the most surprising buffs out of the update was to Acolyte Hybrids out of the Genestealer cult. They didn't have it all their own way, with some slight more restrictions on where they can set up from their cult ambush markers. That will certainly be relevant, but they also did get a big boost to their demolition charges respawning. This was definitely surprising given that Genestealer cults are one of the top factions in the game, and most people have been playing it that if the unit died and respawned, the demolition charges wouldn't be restocked. Genestealer Acolyte Hybrids seem to be basically auto-include for competitive lists for them, often run as big blocks of 10 of them, taking 4 demolition charges, bombs that get to be thrown out at 6-inch range, d6 plus 3 shots at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 2. The actual stat line itself is fairly strong but not absolutely obscene. They do hit on a 5+. It's more the combination of that with all the massive amount of stacked buffs that Genestealer cults can get. They can be quite easily getting those demo charges up to AP-4, having them hit on a 4+ with exploding 6s to hit when they step out of reserve. The Acolytes themselves also get reroll 1s to hit and wound if they're targeting things on objectives, and there are plenty of other options available, things like characters leading the unit for rerolls, or +1 to wound stratagem if you just absolutely need to destroy something big. You could use transports to deliver them, but people often just like that stratagem for one command point to just drop just somewhere outside of 3 inches, so despite having a very short range, then they can be almost impossible to screen. They're certainly an enormous one-hit wonder, and with Genestealer cults being what they are, they can then put a cult ambush marker somewhere on the board, and then when the model's destroyed, they can be popping back up at that marker later in the game, maybe going back into reserve for another stratagem if you have them spare. Previously, the fine text of the rule basically implied that you were just recycling the same unit, even if of course that didn't really make sense with what it was trying to achieve with the idea of more cultists flooding in to join the fight. Now with Games Workshop's ruling, rules as written, it does count as a completely new unit, and by most people's reading of the rules that would mean that they'd come back with the demo charges restocked, or ready to bomb again. They'll probably be a little bit out of position, but they do have options for getting there. They can advance and throw them as their assault weapons, and they can use the stratagem to go back into reserve, though that does cost resources of course. I think lore and feel wise it perhaps does make sense they'd go down this way, but it still does remain a pretty massive power boost to one of the units in the game that was perhaps one of the very strongest out there, and not the way that most people have been playing it based on Games Workshop's previous rules. Can't help but think that these guys are probably going to suffer in the Autumn Balance update as a result. Unless they're changing any rules or anything, I can't help but think that points are going to go up significantly for these guys with the amount of carnage they can deal. Next up, I'm going to say a medium sort of tier nerf came to Ursula Creed. Perhaps not as bad as a couple of the others on the list, but given that she's basically borderline auto-include for the Astra Militarum between her orders and the stratagem things that she can do, I feel like it is worth talking about. Ursula Creed's really quite good value for a commander, I think, just 55 points for 2 orders, allowing her squad to be ordered twice, potentially both on the squad that she is leading I guess, though perhaps more importantly for her stratagem things that she can do. Her Tactical Genius special rule means that you can target one regiment unit in your army within 12 inches, and they can be selected for a stratagem for 0 CP, and even if you use that stratagem somewhere else this phase. The nerf that she's sustained is where the stratagem targets have been locked down a bit. Previously that could have been anything else in your army, including things like massive Baneblades or Rogol Dawn tanks, really quite powerful things that are exactly the sort of things that you want to use stratagems on. Now she's locked to regiment units, which tend to be the ones that are a little bit smaller in power. Perhaps the biggest and best targets are going to be things like massed up blocks of infantry or sentinels in units of 3. I also believe that you can't use this on the reinforcement stratagem as well, even though it's exactly the sort of rule that you'd love to. It has to target a unit that's within 12 inches of her, and you have to use the reinforcement stratagem after the unit's been destroyed, so it won't be on the table anymore and will no longer be within 12 inches. I think Creed is still well worth including in most Imperial Guard lists, though. You just have to dedicate a squad for her to go in. Perhaps some of the best choices are Fields of Fire for 2 command points. That one can allow you to ping some shots into an enemy unit, and everything gets an extra AP -1 against them. That could be really quite significant, particularly on things with lower AP like battle cannons. Or other options could be Expert Bombardiers for Voxcasters, spotting for artillery. -1 damage could still be used on Sentinels, as they're also regimental units, could make them even more obscenely tough to take out. Or I suppose potentially using Overwatch, the options might be a bit more limited if you can't use it on things like Hellhounds anymore. Overall, I still think that she's a pretty excellent commander and a good deal for 55 points, but definitely breaks a few of her better combos, buffing things like Lehman Rusted and Dawns that she was marching to war alongside with her infantry. Next up, and another really big winner for the update, is the Transcendant C'Tan from the Necrons, a 280 point enslaved star god that I would have already considered one of the very best models in their army. For the most common competitive lists, it seemed to be often a choice between him or the Void Dragon, or occasionally both. The Void Dragon being rather excellent against knights and vehicles, and just massively destructive against them. The Transcendent C'Tan having access to that Sempiternal Weave upgrade, a 10-point upgrade to give him a massive 4+ Feel No Pain type save, which just seemed absolutely hilariously auto-include on an already very tanky model, and makes this guy one of the most durable models in the entire game. I think at least some people were a bit apprehensive as to whether or not that was really intended by Games Workshop, particularly as the datasheet had an obvious error on it already, missing reanimation protocols on it. I think there was some question whether or not they meant him to be an epic hero like the rest, even if he wasn't a named one, or whether it could be really intentional that a 10-point upgrade could really double the durability of one of Necron's toughest models already. It seems though that both of the updates that Games Workshop could have made to him have gone their way. They haven't done anything about the weave, so he still gets that, so he remains absolutely monstrously tough, and they did fix his reanimation protocols, giving him the keyword back, meaning that not only does he have god tier durability, about twice the amount of the other C'Tan out there, but he also now can regenerate those wounds too, and potentially quite a lot of them if there's a Canoptech reanimator nearby. For his damage output, he's got some fairly general purpose attacks, Crackling Tendrils in melee for a bunch of damage d6 close combat attacks with sustained hits, and shoots out a fairly general purpose shooting attack with his Seismic Assault. The damage output isn't absolutely standout, but he does have a trick to be able to teleport around the board if he advances, so you could put him into the opponent's backfield and give them some major problems if you wanted to do a big power move. If you can put your opponent in the position where they actually need to try and kill him though, they're usually going to struggle. His toughness 11, he's got a 4+ invulnerable save, 12 wounds and halves damage, then he'll have that 4+ Feel No Pain type save, and it means point per point, if you want to kill 100 points worth of this model, you need to average 10 last cannon hits on him. Kind of ridiculous, unless you're going to be able to focus an entire army's worth of firepower on him. I think that's around about the same or better as just about any other monster or vehicle in the game of 40k right now. It comfortably beats out other very tough things like the Tyrannofex point for point. Then if you do restore those wounds, you're essentially regenerating 46 points worth of C'Tan defense each time you activate normally. 5 last cannon hits landed on average to need to take that off again, and if you can keep him within range of a Canoptech reanimator earlier in the game, you could be getting 2d3 back and just hilariously laughing off a huge amount of damage. Overall looks like a very strong model. Wouldn't be too surprised to see him continuing to be present in Necron army lists as another massively durable anvil to go with their warriors or Lich Guard. Finally, and for the third of the biggest losers in my opinion out of this update, are the Atalan Jackals. A pretty competitive Genestealer cult unit, so I guess it hasn't been all their way. I feel like these guys have probably dipped to the point where they're probably just going to take more units of other sorts now, more neophytes, acolytes or aberrants. The Jackals are a fairly lightly armoured scout biker squad, 80 points for 5 of them or 160 for 10. They move into the midfield, and their main trick is to throw a whole bunch of demo charge bombs around. The way that their rule works is to finish a move within 6 inches of the enemy. Each bite gets to roll a dice, and on a 4+ you deal a mortal wound, so it could be an average of 5 mortal wounds for a squad of 10, plus a bunch of a flurry of light infantry type attacks. They are kind of lightly armoured and very easy to kill for the right sort of weapons, so they weren't an auto-include for the Genestealer cults, even with their more powerful version. But the thing that seemed to tip them over the edge for at least a fair few people was that they could take an Jackal Alphas, one of their sniper support characters, which gets its own precision shots and marks some targets for the rest of the army, but also gave them a fairly useful move shoot move mechanic, so you get to move, drop off demo charges, then shoot, and then move again, and that second move could also be used to proxy the demo charge demolition run. Seemed kind of unintentional and probably a bit of an oversight from Games Workshop, kind of rare that they let any unit just double down on their special rule and deal an average of 11 mortal wounds, I think it was. And it looks like they've addressed this by making the demolition run just happen once per battle round, so you can't double down. Perhaps unsurprising, though I feel like it means that they're probably going to drop off the radar for a fair few players out there, or just be pushed a bit more back to their intended role of being some slightly pricier outrider bikes that you might want a few of for screening, but probably not loads. They also do have a bit of a question with the Cult Ambush rule, particularly for big squads as well. The new version of the Cult Ambush rule, as they rewrote it, means that all your models need to drop within 3 inches of the token that was on the board. With a max-sized Jackal squad with those enormous Wolf quad bases, you can't actually fit all of your models wholly within that 3-inch token. And unlike a few similar rules, it doesn't really say what happens if you can't, whether the extra models are just counted as lost, or whether the unit just can't set up, or some sort of stipulation to just deploy the models as close as possible, like works with dedicated transports and large bases. Overall, perhaps not the best news for the Genestealer Cult Scout bikers. Their massive mortal wound trick's been taken away, and there's a rules change that's probably in need of a further FAQ for how they can redeploy. And with all the other great Genestealer Cult units out there, they're probably going to struggle to compete. Might not be the worst thing overall for the Genestealer Cults to be toned down a bit. As mentioned earlier, being one of the strongest factions in the game, I could easily see some nerfs happening to Neophytes, Acolytes and Aberrants when the next balance pass rolls around. So anyway, let me know what you make of the list. Which of the models do you think that have come off the best or worst out of Games Workshop's last update? Let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos coming on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.